It's more fun with more than one person. Traditional video games have been single-player affairs, playing against the computer for decades. Now we're changing that. It's taken a long time for the video game people to realize that, perhaps, but also the technology had to catch up to the point where video games could do it. Now we often have more than one person involved in video games. They might be in teams, playing online. They might be co-op, playing locally or online. And of course there are MMOs, massively multiplayer online games, where there can be thousands of players playing with and against one another. But everybody who played Dungeons & Dragons knew that 40 years ago. Cooperation is required for survival. Here again, single-player video games have inured us to the notion that one person can survive, one person can do everything. In point of fact, in practically, that's not possible. That was very obvious in first edition Dungeons & Dragons, although more recent versions have moved toward the video game ideal of one-man army, especially third edition D&D. But in the original version of D&D, that wasn't true. You needed a fairly large party, and everybody had to work together in combined arms, or they were going to die. Think before you leap. You would think this would be obvious, but it's not. People turn their brains off. A lot of video games you don't need to use your brains much, or you can afford to turn your brains off. But that's not the way it was in original D&D, and again in more recent versions of D&D that has changed somewhat. And this applies to game design, of course. You want to think about things before you try something out, or you'll waste a lot of time. Get organized. Many adventuring parties in D&D failed simply because they were poorly organized. The really peak of poor organization was to split the party when you didn't need to. That was close to suicide. D&D showed us how much difference it made when you had your stuff together. And this also applies to game design as well. Game design isn't just creativity and floating around. You've got to stay organized. You've got to write things down. If you don't write things down, you're not a game designer as far as I'm concerned, because you'll forget so much and miss out on so much that I don't want to know you. Another lesson, don't run headlong where you've never been. I've seen too many D&D parties run away, but run in a different direction than from where they came from, and run into something bad, and of course they've got whatever it is pursuing them, and they die. A simple lesson: if you have to run away, go a way that you've been, not a new way. Keep track of the stuff you've got. Otherwise you may forget something that could save your butt. When things go bad in D&D, it's time to look at what you've got, what you're carrying, remind yourself what magic items you've got, and even what non-magic items you've got, and maybe there's something there that will help you out. But often people forget to check, and then they end up having a much harder time than they should. Always have a viable plan B, not just a plan B, but a viable plan B. This is another obvious one. But in D&D there were no reloadable saves. You had to do things right the first time or you could get dead. And this is good advice for game designers too. Don't get yourself into a hole where there's no way out. Always have a plan B. And always have a way out. This is one of the biggest lessons, because it's contrary to first impressions. When I first saw Dungeons & Dragons, I thought it was a big-time dice game, and I, at the time, always said, I hate dice games. But I discovered when I played that it's more like a microcosm of life. What you can do is avoid the occasions when you have to depend on a dice roll to come good to survive. You won't always be able to do that, but you can minimize the number of times you have a life and death dice roll. Now here's my favorite example. A party of 9th level adventurers in some 10th, near the end of a big adventure, big room with 2 iron golems in it. If you're not familiar with D&D, iron golems breathe poison gas. So if you go and fight them hand to hand, and they're essentially immune to spells, they breathe poison gas on everybody who's fighting them hand to hand. Fortunately, by detection spells and so on, we knew they were there. We had a couple clerics who had really good saving throws against poison. And we had lots of magic items that we could give them to increase their saving throw. So we could get them both to the point where the only way they could fail their saving throw was to roll a 1 on a 20-sided die, 5% chance. Well, I said, let's not have both people go in there at once because they could get really unlucky and then we'd be in a mess because only the clerics could raise people from the dead, and more important, only the clerics could cure poison. Oh, no problem, no problem. Well, lo and behold, they walked in, both of them, attacked the iron golem. I think actually it was just 1 iron golem rather than 2. And they both rolled 1s. 1 chance in 400, 1 chance in 400 happens. So they both died because we had no way to cure the poison. And we had to go in there and fight the boogers hand to hand. I was a magic user and I was fighting an iron golem hand to hand at some point. Fortunately, nobody else died, but there we were with 2 dead clerics and no way to raise them. And that's because we depended on luck too much. And this lesson is especially important for game designers. Trial and error, which is guess and check, you're depending on luck to get lucky, is inefficient at best, hopeless at worst. You need to analyze why something isn't working and then figure out what would make sense to fix that problem, not just guess at it. Unfortunately, the modern zeitgeist is, use the force, Luke. Don't depend on the computers. Use your intuition. And intuition can be good, but logic can be better if you think about what the problem is rather than just depending on luck. Now I have to confess that D&D didn't actually teach me all these things because I was 25 years old when I started to play D&D and I'd been playing games for many years. Games taught me these things. But D&D illustrates the points very well. And here is the reference to the written version, the earlier written version of this.